I want to say a few words about this weekly reading. We're finishing Sefer Vayikra, the book of Leviticus, and the last two parshiot that we're going to read the Shabbat, they're somewhat related to each other. They're called Behar and Bechukotai. Behar talks about the Shemitah and the Jubilee year. The word Jubilee in English, by the way, comes from Yovel in Hebrew, the 50th year. So there are 7 and 50. The same similar idea as we have, for instance, now counting the Omer, the 7 weeks and the 50th days of Shavuot. And here it's counting the years. So it used to be that the Beit Din, the main Jewish, the Supreme Court, if you could say, it would count every year, and on the 50th would be the Jubilee year, when all the fields come back and all kinds of things happen. And it's also a year when the land rests. 2 years in a row, the land rests. The 7th year, every 7th year, and then on the 49th year, when 7 weeks of years, 7-year periods passed, there is a Shemitah, and then immediately there is Yovel, a Jubilee year. So 2 years in a row, the land rests. By the way, Rabbi Simcha from Dvinsk, the author of Or Sameach, he writes an interesting idea that it's easier for people to give back the land that they bought when on the 50th year they have to give back the land, if on that year anyway you can't gather any crop. It makes it a little easier. So the Torah here simplifies a little bit the task. It's very hard when you have bought the land and you used it for maybe 30 or 40 years, and now you have to give it back to the original owner. But if you know that the whole year anyway you can't gather any crop, it makes it slightly easier. So it might be here the Torah is simplifying the task. Kineged Yetzer Hara, as the Chazal call it, certain mitzvot. The Torah makes it a little bit easier because of the Yetzer Hara, because of the evil inclination that people naturally have. Whatever the case may be, the main discussion of the book of the parsha of Behar is regarding the Shemitah, the 7th year when the land rests, and the Jubilee year when the land not only rests, but even all the land that was purchased goes back, and all kinds of other laws, the laws of a house that was bought in a city, and many other laws that have to do with possession. And you could see, by the way, as Maharatz Chayes used to say, that the Torah, we usually say that in many different ways, the Torah takes the middle way. So in terms of the ideal state of the system or financial system, the Torah is neither promoting socialism nor capitalism. It's somewhere in between. So on the one hand, people can own things, and some people were very rich. But on the other hand, the Torah doesn't want anybody to ever lose their ancestral land. So in the times when the Jubilee year was practiced, the people would, even if they're poor and they sold the land, they would get it back. And of course, the fact that after 7 years the loans were cancelled and all kinds of similar laws, one of the main purposes is protecting, in a way, the poor, so that the rich don't become overly rich in a lot of cases. They could still make money on other things, but in terms of land, you're not going to have people who just own huge amounts of land, because everything goes back after a certain amount of time. And on the other hand, this is not to make the system a socialist type of system, right? And certainly not a communist type of system. So it's somewhere in between. It's a very reasonable and very much the Torah strives to make sure that the poor do have another chance and they don't completely become impoverished forever. So that's the main discussion of the book of the Parsha of Behar. And the Bechukotai, of course, its main topic is our exile. We call this this particular part of the Parsha Tochecha. Tochecha means rebuke. There are only 2 such parshiot. Of course, the Torah tells us all kinds of rebukes in all kinds of places, but there are only 2 parshiot where the rebuke is very extensive with all kinds of details, and they both start with good, what will happen if we do listen to Hashem's voice, and then they go on to the various punishments that will happen if we do not listen to Hashem's voice. So these are the 2 parshiot. One is in the end of book of Vayikra. We always read it at least a week before the holiday of Shavuot. We don't want Shavuot to start right after, and we certainly don't want the curses to remain for after Shavuot. And similarly, there is another parsha like that, which we read at least an extra week before Rosh Hashanah. There's always at least one parsha after it before Rosh Hashanah, and that is the parsha of Ki Tavo. So we have 2 parshiot which have tochecha, which have rebuke, And that is, it starts with good, but then it goes on to the curses that will happen if we don't listen to Hashem. The parsha of Bechukotai this week, and the parsha of Kitavo at the end of the Torah. And there are certain differences between the two rebukes. Our parsha has a lot to do, the rebuke has a lot to do with the parsha of Behar. So the fact that we read them together actually makes a lot of sense. They could have combined other parshot on years when we have too few Shabbatot and certain parshot have to be combined. But why not combine, for instance, Emor with Behar? Why Emor is a separate parsha, but Behar is combined with Bechukotai on years that have one other. So the reason is that Behar and Bechukotai actually have a very great connection. The exile, the first exile, was for us not keeping Shemitah, and the Torah emphasizes it. And the exile was for the specific number of years. Prophet Yirmiyahu predicts in two different places that the exile will be for 70 years. And later that was fulfilled. So it was the years that the Jewish people throughout the almost 1,000 years of our history from the time we entered the land of Israel until we were exiled by Babylonia. It was close to 900 years. It's a huge period of time. And there were some years when we did not keep either the 7th year or the Jubilee year or both, under wicked kings, for instance, which existed in those times, and under certain other periods of time before when we had kingship, in the times of Shoftim, in times of what's called judges. So all those years combined into a 70-year period of exile. The punishment was for 70 years. So the Torah here emphasizes specifically that it will be to let the land rest. You didn't let the land rest when I demanded, Hashem says, so now I'll force you to make the land rest, because you'll be exiled. And then there was, of course, the period of our second temple period, and according to Chazal, it was 420 years, some say it was longer, but whatever the case may be, after that, we had a second exile, which ultimately led to the huge dispersion of the Jewish people. In the first exile, the majority of Jewish people still lived relatively near the land of Israel. Many of them were what we call today Sephardi Jews, the ancestors of Sephardi Jews. Even though they're not really from Sfarad, even if you say that Sfarad, the word Sfarad is a biblical term, and later Spain was called that way, but it's not clear at all that in the Torah, Sfarad actually means Spain. But that's not even important. The important thing is that most Jews, at any rate, who are in the countries which we call Sephardi Jews, are not really from Spain. For instance, Bukharian Jews, they were never in Spain, at least most of them. They were there for over 2,000 years, 2,500 years or so, in the lands of Uzbekistan and similar places, Tajikistan, but they were never in Spain. But in general, since the customs of Sephardi Jews are all similar, so what they call Edot HaMizrach, the eastern communities, they usually call them Sephardim, even though they're not really from Spain, and their ancestors were never in Spain. But whatever the case may be, the first exile was mostly into the countries that were in the east or near Eretz Israel, near the land of Israel. The second exile was a much more extensive exile, and I happen to be an Ashkenazi Jew, so we ended up in Europe eventually, in the Roman Empire, and later in other places in Europe, and later in Germany, and in Eastern Europe, and ended up in the Russian Empire eventually when Russia divided Poland and took some of the lands where Jews lived. So that's how the long history of Ashkenazic Jews, from about an exile of about 2,000 years ago, a little bit less than 2,000 years ago. Our history was through Italy, through many different European countries, and we, according to many commentators, including the Zohar Hadash and Ramban, the exile that is hinted in the book of Dvarim, in Parshat Kitavo, in the second Tochacha, second rebuke, that's the second exile. There are other commentators who say that there is no clear division here, that both Tochacha number 1 that we're going to read this week and the Tochacha number 2 that we're going to read before Rosh Hashanah both talk about both exiles. There's no, in a sense, the exile continued from first to second, the whole second temple period time, even though we had, after the rebellion of Hanukkah, after the Jews got independence, we had a certain Jewish country for a certain time period. But with all that, a lot of Jews still remained in exile, so you could look at the entire period as one big exile. So in a certain sense, according to some commentators, including Abarbanel, both the Tochacha we'll read this week and the Tochacha we'll read almost half a year from now are similar. They're both talking about both exiles in one way or another. But according to Ramban, the division is pretty clear. The first Tochecha is the first exile, the second Tochecha is the second exile. Both, of course, talk about the fact that the land of Israel will be basically almost empty, which was fulfilled completely. People forget that, the way that now Israel is full of people and it's so different from the way it was just 150 years ago. People just forget about it. They don't realize how empty and backward the place was. That just nearby Turkey or even Syria was in so much better shape throughout all this time, or Egypt, or any of the countries. It was only Israel that was like so completely, there was like very, very few people living there. Very, very few. This was true about 1,000 years ago. This was true about 200 years ago. There were just certain areas and certain places where some people lived. A little bit of Jews, a little bit of Arabs. The Arabs conquered these lands about 1,400 years ago or something like that. I mean, this is also something that people forget a lot of times. I mean, if you keep telling people for a few generations already that the so-called Palestinians are the original people, so they start believing themselves into this lie. But it was Jews who were called Palestinian. It was very well known. They said the Yerushalmi, the Jerusalem Talmud, they used to call Palestinian Talmud in English. You could just look in the sources, some 70 or 80 years ago, they would say PT, Palestinian Talmud. That's how they called Yerushalmi in English. Palestinian Talmud, because the Jews were Palestine. Professor Shaul Lieberman, for instance, calls his books about Jewish Palestine. Right? There were other people in Palestine. Palestine was the name that the Romans invented for this place, but there were other people, but they're also not Arabs. The people who call themselves Palestinians today are actually regular Arabs. Most of them genetically do not differ. I mean, a lot of them came just within 100, maybe a little bit more years ago for working during the period between the two world wars, when England was given these areas in order to create a Jewish home. They actually made sure that the Jews do not come in large numbers. They had a quota, and the Arabs were coming in huge numbers at that time period. And later, UNRWA, the UN agency, that instead of resettling the refugees, actually made them permanent refugees and their descendants, the unique case of the Palestinian refugees, so-called. They actually define a refugee anybody who lived there 2 years. So when they claim they lived there for thousands of years, look, the law of UNRWA is 2 years. All you have to do is live between 46 and 48 in the land of Israel, and you're already considered a refugee. So a family that came for trying to make money in the infrastructure the Jews were building, and they lived there for 2 years, they're already a refugee. They're already considered Palestinians forever and ever. All their descendants, even their descendants on one line, right? Something unbelievable that happened, and the world basically made sure that this is a permanent problem. Even though they could easily come back to the places where they came from. There were some Arabs who lived there longer. Maybe some of them lived for hundreds of years. I don't know. Most of the Arabs who lived there for hundreds of years are probably the ones that actually are more pro-Israel today, and that is the Bedouins. They lived in the south probably for longer periods of time. But at any rate, both the culture, the language, the religion, all of these people, they are not the ancient Philistines or anybody else who lived in the land of Israel. They have nothing to do with any of these groups, right? Because the Arabs only came to the land of Israel some 1,400 years ago, like 2,000 years after the Jews were already there, more than 2,000 years. So the Jews have a much longer history in the land of Israel. Whereas the Arabs, they came at some point and conquered all of these lands. The truth is, the lands next to the land of Israel also, they were not Arabs. The Syrians, the Aramim, what's called the Aram, was not an Arab country, obviously, and so too Babylonia, right? The ancient Babel and Kasdim, Chaldeans, they were not Arabs. This is Iraq today is Arab, and Syria today is Arab, and all these other places today, in Egypt today is Arab. But these are all countries that had completely different populations. So the Arabs conquered all of them. It's actually the only country where the original population came back is the land of Israel, where the majority of population is the people who lived there before the Arabs. But all the other countries next to Israel, they're all occupied by the Arabs. So when people talk about colonizers and make the Jews into colonizers and the Arabs to the original population, the so-called Palestinians, even the Arabs themselves never called themselves Palestinians. They admitted it. It's on record that they're doing it only to fool the Europeans. It's only done in order to make it look like they're the original population. But it was the Jews who were called Palestinians. There are passports of Jews who lived there under the British who were called Palestinian in the passport. There are people still, some old people who still kept that passport under the British. Of course, there are few and few of them, and as people after 2-3 generations, they die. So the so-called Palestinians now actually believe. It seems like the young generation of Palestinians actually forgot where they come from. They used to be very proud that they conquered these lands. Of course, it was such a big thing for them that they're the conquerors. And now it's not popular to be a conqueror. It's popular to be a poor refugee. So they say they're the originals, and it's the Jews who came and exiled them. By the way, the Jews in particular were the most kind, much kinder than any other country in similar situation. And that is, even though the Jews were being killed by the Arabs constantly, and in Hebron there was a pogrom in the 20s. In Jerusalem they tried very hard to destroy the Jews, and the Jews were always being threatened. And when the war for independence resulted in Israel, when Israel accepted the partition plan and even the tiny part of the land that was given to them by the UN. Interesting, right? The League of Nations used to give Israel, the Jewish state, even what's today's Jordan. England, which was given the mandate to make the Jewish state, instead limited the number of Jews, and 4/5, about 80% or so, was given as a separate country in Jordan, where not a Jew lives, and the Jew is not allowed to buy land there at all by the Jordanian laws. So the majority of land was already given to Arabs, if you call them Palestinians, right? The Palestinian Arabs, even if you call them as a separate nation in some sense, they already have a land that's four times Israel. But later, even the little part that was left, the UN voted to give Israel, to give the Jews only a very small part of that. I mean, if you don't count the desert in the south, the part that was given to them is a very tiny part of the place which was actually where people could live. The desert was not a kind of place where it's easy to build anything and to live, but the actual area of living was very tiny that was given. And yet Jews accepted it, and the Arabs did not. And the Arabs started the war of annihilation, and they openly said it, that they're trying to destroy the Jews. And yet, when Israel won that war, many of the Arabs remained within Israel, but not a single Jew remained in the part of the land that was conquered by Jordan. The entire holiest place for us, the Jewish quarter in Jerusalem, was destroyed, and not a single Jew remained there. Those who weren't killed were exiled. And with all that, Israel accepted all that, and they made a peace treaty with Jordan. And then Jordan tried to fight them again during the 6-day war. They were told specifically, don't attack, we won't attack you, but they attacked. And again, Jews are the ones who were the most kindest. They could have just destroyed every Arab there, that most of these Arabs were enemies. But no, when they conquered these lands from Jordan and were able to return the Jews who always lived in these lands, and guess what? The Arabs still remained. And that's the Shtachim, what they call now occupied territories. Occupied by whom? Jordan is the one who occupied it and never made a Palestinian state there. But it was the Jews when they got it back, and when the Jews were able to live in their ancient homeland, in the places where we lived for the longest time and were just exiled a few years ago by the Jordanians. In the 48, they were exiled by the Jordanians, and now in 67, they were able to get these lands back. And they didn't destroy all the Arabs, they didn't exile all the Arabs. On the contrary, the Arabs since then multiplied many, many times. In the Gaza area, for instance, there used to be like 100,000 Arabs, and now there is 2 million of them. They're the ones who are multiplying very fast, but the Jews didn't exile them and didn't destroy them all this time. And yet, they are the ones who gave Gaza a full independence, and in Gaza, they're the ones who made a terrorist state and started working harder to destroy the rest of Israel. They're the ones who, when they were offered under Arafat, who the Jews thought it was possible to make some kind of a peace deal, they were offered basically almost the entire part of the land that the so-called Palestinians consider occupied. And yet, what happened afterwards? Arafat didn't accept the deal. He wasn't interested, because they believe that the entire land of Israel belongs to them. So my point is that the unfairness of the situation and the fact that the Jews are so kind and so unbelievably nice to the monsters who are trying to destroy them. Look at how, for instance, the Allies dealt with Germans during World War II. Look at all these areas that used to belong to Germany and all these refugees from Germany who ended up in faraway places. Even the Italians, who were much nicer than the Germans, but so many Italians, hundreds of thousands of them, were exiled from areas that are today Croatia and other places, and nobody cares. None of these, there are millions of refugees all over the world since then, and nobody cares about anybody. But the Palestinian refugees, they have a whole agency that their descendants forever and ever are considered refugees, and they all want to flood Eretz Israel and destroy the only Jewish state. So this is the interesting situation, that while most of them have nothing to do with the land of Israel, but they are the ones who created artificially some connection to the land that's not theirs. The Arabs who came and conquered it, and the Arabs who came later to work there, and the Arabs who were destroying us and who were killing us, and the Arabs with whom we are willing to, we stretched our hand many, many times to make peace with them. But they want the whole thing. It's not a question of them having their state. They already have state of Jordan, and they could in theory have another state within the tiny Israel if they would accept, and we would be sure that they're accepting it. From then on, they're not going to continue attacking and continue the terrorist work. But instead, what they're doing is trying to get, even if they agree on two-state solution, it's obvious that they're going to use it in order to destroy the rest of Israel, because they never actually agreed. They never actually agreed that they would have Jews as the majority in any part of Israel. And that's the real problem. It's not a question of them having a state, it's a question of them destroying the Jews. And by the way, this whole issue has nothing to do with this, with Zionism, in my opinion, because Zionism is a political movement. But the fact that Jews who live now in Israel can continue living there and should be feeling safe, that's not a Zionist issue. No matter how anti-Zionist someone is, they don't want to be destroyed. That's why the vast majority of Orthodox Jews, even if they don't support Zionism per se as a movement, but they definitely do not want the Palestinian state to take over, because they know what will happen. They know when ISIS took over all these places, what happened to Christians, what happened to other minorities, right? Nobody trusts them. There's a few people who are a little bit loony, I think, that think that they could survive under the Palestinian rule. But the answer is it's not going to happen. What will happen is that the Jews will be totally destroyed if Arabs would have the majority and would be able to. They're not hiding these things. In fact, this whole idea of two-state solution, by the way, is based that the Arabs will remain in Israel, but the Jews will have to all be thrown out of the place which will be the so-called Palestinian state. How is that fair? The Jews lived there for all this time. If it wasn't for Jordanians who exiled them, the Jews would be continuing to live in the various areas like Hebron and other places. Right? In Hebron in particular, actually, the Jewish presence was destroyed and eliminated in the 20s. There was a huge pogrom where the Arabs came and killed every single Jew that they could lay their hands on, and those who were able to hide, later the British moved them away. So that's how the Jews lost Hebron. But Yerushalayim and many other places, the Jews continued to live until 48, and it's during the War for Independence when the Jews were kicked out of those areas. So how is it fair that the Palestinians want the entire area back and the Jews will have no access to it and all the Jews will be kicked out of there? Would they like it if the Jews kicked all the Arabs out of the area that remains a Jewish state? Obviously nobody's even thinking about that. So my point is that it's not the Jews who are the problem. But one thing that you could learn is from our Parsha is that the fact that the land was so empty is that it gave a chance at least. There would never be a comeback of Jews if the land already belonged to Arabs in a large sense of it, meaning if the Arabs had a flourishing state, if they would have something similar to at least Syria or Turkey in the land of Israel, there would be no chance they would ever let the Jews back. It was only because it was almost empty that the Jews, when they were coming back, there was not such a great movement against it. Although later, like I said, once the Jews started coming back in larger numbers, the British did everything to limit the number of Jews coming. And the Arabs were complaining terribly and didn't want. Although many of the Arabs who actually owned the land were willing to sell it. At those times, it wasn't hard for the Arabs owning the land, those who had private land. And they were selling it to the Jews. And the Jews, they didn't come to it like the settlers in America, for instance, like the colonizers. They were actually buying the land. There were Jewish millionaires who were footing the bill. And a lot of the land was completely impossible to live in. It was the Jews who made the land work again. It's those exact predictions of the Torah that the land will start giving its crop. It's all those things started getting fulfilled when the Jews worked on it and made the terrible dumpsters where it was impossible. There were sicknesses. There was a land that was impossible to live in, and they made it into the Gan Eden that it could become. And today, if the Arabs would accept the Jewish presence there, they could become very much the beneficiaries of all this. Just like the Druzes, just like to a large extent the Bedouins, who are much more, by the way, the nations that actually live there much longer in the land of Israel than the regular Arabs. Like I said, the majority of regular Arabs, the vast majority, are there for maybe a couple of generations there, or a few generations. They're not there that long. I'm talking about from before the land of Israel, before the state of Israel, right? A lot of them came within basically one generation of the British control of the land, and some of them came under the end of Turkish control, but they were not there for generations and generations. and certainly not for thousands of years. Here is a small challenge. Find if the archaeologist can find one thing that was written in Arabic in the land of Israel from, let's say, 1500 years ago or earlier, from the times of Talmud or from the times of Mishnah or from the times of biblical times, a single thing that was written not in Hebrew. One thing. Everything is written in Hebrew only. Nothing was ever found written in Arabic, obviously, because everybody knows. The Arabs knew that too, that they came to these lands much, much later. Anyway, I'm going to end on this, and I hope that B'ezrat Hashem, we will be able to live in peace. Unfortunately, it's only peace through strength that works in this type of area. When Mashiach comes, hopefully people will actually be different and will accept peace through just peace, not through strength and through absence of war. But for now, the hope is that peace through strength will work in the Holy Land.